It may feel like you can't do anything to preserve your constitutional rights under the Trump administration, but organizations like Public Citizen are fighting back through the court and are mostly winning. Public Citizen has filed 13 lawsuits against the Trump administration so far, and there are more to come.
That's very concerning because it's one of the few sort of guardrails or protections to make sure that constitutional rights are being respected and that there's some sort of balance for, the great power that the Homeland Security Department has to pull people off the streets, to control, to revoke visas, are not being used in a way that is discriminatory or that runs afoul of the Constitution.
That's Karla Gilbride, director of Public Citizen's Litigation Group. The Trump administration's massive funding cuts, department closures, and consolidation of power has profound impacts on U.S. residents and people all around the world. But what's equally important is that these actions are illegal. By sharing your personal data with Elon Musk, closing civil rights offices within the Department of Homeland Security, and dismantling USAID, Donald Trump violated acts of Congress. Through these actions, Trump continues to abuse the power of the executive branch and violate the separation of powers outlined by the U.S. Constitution. Plus, Trump's power grab has real, oftentimes deadly impacts. Now, you're more vulnerable to predatory loans, like the ones that caused the 2008 financial crisis. Over 100 people will die per hour due to USAID funding cuts related to diseases like HIV and tuberculosis alone. And nobody is watching over the Department of Homeland Security to make sure it respects your constitutional rights. The good news is that organizations like Public Citizen are taking Trump to court, and they're succeeding. Analysis by Bloomberg shows that among more than 300 lawsuits filed against Donald Trump's administration, judges have halted abusive government policies significantly more than they have allowed them. Karla Gilbride is one of the lawyers fighting Trump in the courtroom and leads Public Citizen's litigation team. Thank you so much again for joining me today. Can you start off by introducing yourself and your work?
Sure. My name is Karla Gilbride. I am the Deputy Director of the Public Citizen Litigation Group. Public Citizen is a consumer rights organization that fights for health, safety, and government transparency.
We're here today to talk about your litigation against the Trump administration. And this Trump presidency has been largely characterized by things like federal funding cuts, unlawful deportations, and the dismantling of government departments. But before we get into Public Citizen's 13 lawsuits against the Trump administration, can you just give us a broad sense of how, from a legal standpoint, this presidency embodies a quote-unquote full-blown authoritarian crisis?
Well, there are definitely a lot of concerning signs from the first 3 months or so of this administration in terms of full-scale attacks on the rule of law and on democratic checks and balances. So we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the ways in which the executive branch has tried to overstep its bounds and do things that are only within the province of Congress to do. But other things that I think kind of speak to that same attack on constitutional freedoms and separation of powers is just the attack on dissent, on anyone who sort of speaks critically of the administration, and that some of the actions involving deportation of students and people who are here on certain immigrant visas being targeted because of publishing op-eds or participating in protest or exercising their First Amendment rights to take positions that the administration sees as critical. And then other actions that kind of fall into that bucket are attacks on law firms that are seen as having, been helpful to perhaps the political opponents of this administration, and that is grounds for limiting their access to practicing their profession and participating in court, and just, a lot of very retributive, retaliatory actions against people who are seen as political dissidents. And I would say, for myself, before coming to public citizen, I was working at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and was fired from my position there along with two of the EEOC commissioners. And that's just one of many independent agencies that this president has sought to, sort of fire people from in an unprecedented way, taking the position that he has the sole authority to act as the sort of unitary executive and only have people of his choosing in positions, even in positions that historically have had some independence from the presidency by design, that have been intended to have some distance and some space so that the president isn't controlling all um, sort of functions of the government. That's something that this president is seeking to really take on more power and more control for himself.
Moving into the 13 lawsuits that Public Citizen has filed against the Trump administration, something that Public Citizen is concerned with is that Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, were given broad access to Americans' personal information. Can you start off by describing the privacy rights that Americans have and why it's important that personal information isn't handed over to people like Elon Musk?
Absolutely. So in interacting with the government, people give over lots of private information, their social security numbers, their taxpayer information, information about who lives in their household, and even information about their citizenship and immigration status. And there are certain protections that individuals are entitled to expect in terms of how that personal information will be treated. There are several statutes that sort of list what those protections are for people. One is the Privacy Act, and another with regard to taxpayer information is the Internal Revenue Code. So, one of the sort of the understandings that people have when they turn over their private information to the government is that the government will take precautions and only use that information for what it absolutely needs to be used for and won't share it outside of the specific function that they're giving it for. So, for example, if you are a Social Security recipient, you have to give information to the federal government in order to get your Social Security check, but that will only be used for those limited purposes. And so one concern early on in the Trump administration is that a lot of private individuals who were not formerly associated with government came in and started having access to government secure databases, like the Bureau of Fiscal Services, was a database that the Treasury Department operates to house a lot of this sort of secure information that Social Security beneficiaries or federal employees or anyone who sort of does business with the federal government as taxpayers or people who receive money from the government, your information is stored in this Bureau of Fiscal Services database. And through Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, many of these people had come in from the outside, did not have a history of going through sort of the vetting process and the training on how to handle private data that longtime government employees would have, but yet they were given access to these databases sort of very early on in the administration. And so we filed suit representing the Association of Retired Americans and two labor unions, the Service Employees International Union and American Federation of Government Employees, all of whom, their members of these groups have information stored in these databases, either as retirees or as federal workers. And we're concerned that the privacy protections of the Federal Privacy Act and the Internal Revenue Code were not being followed in this sort of wholesale granting of access to DOGE. So we filed suit in federal district court on February 3rd, so early, in the Trump administration, and received some discovery, sort of understanding what the scope of this infiltration into the databases was, what access did DOGE actually have. And the district court found, that it basically wasn't sure how immediate the harm was, that wanted to sort of allow for further factual development. So following that further factual development, we actually filed a motion for summary judgment in April, and are waiting for the court to rule on that motion right now. So it's before the court, and we're hoping that the court will, validate these privacy interests that our clients have for basically making sure that when they give information to the government, it stays protected and isn't at risk of being open up to hackers or whatever else Doge is doing with it without our consent and without the protections that the federal statutes provide.
You just talked a little bit about the two lawsuits that you have against Doge related to privacy and what the courts have found in relation to the scope and the importance of these privacy violations. But can you go a little bit more into why people should care that their privacy rights are being violated, both in terms of maybe the immediate impact and also the precedent that it sets?
Well, again, I mean, the reason that these laws are in place is to say that if the government is getting access to your private information, they're going to only use it for very specific, limited purposes. And if they're going to, and that no sort of disclosure to any third parties will happen without, sort of letting the targets of that information, or the people whose information it is, know how it's being used, that you have a right to know how information about you is being used and who has access to it. And that wasn't honored here. And so the question, the threat or the precedent is that this data can be shared for purposes that we don't know anything about, that it is vulnerable to hackers or to other, sort of AI being sort of put together with other data and aggregated with other data, and used, sort of in ways that we did not consent to and don't have a choice about, because once the government has access to the data and shares it in ways that are broader than these narrow, limited things that are sort of allowed under like the Internal Revenue Code, it's only for tax purposes, for example. But once you take those guardrails away and say that, sort of it can be used for anything that Doge thinks is efficient, or perhaps would allow for things to be more streamlined. If there was one central database that had everyone's information in it, there's really no telling what that could be used for, or what other third parties or what other criminal elements or other countries or someone else could gain access to that data, and we would lose any sort of control over our personal private data. So the reason why we're concerned is that the government has a lot of information about a lot of people, and so by design there are a lot of checks and balances for how they can use that, what approval they have to get for what they do with it, and who has access to it. And it's just been treated with a lot of sloppiness, and those protections haven't been honored. And so we really don't know. That's part of the concern, is that we don't know exactly what's being done with our data, who has access to it, and what safeguards are in place to make sure that hackers and other sort of unauthorized parties don't get access to it if those sort of protections aren't being respected.
You said earlier that things like immigration status are now being shared with Doge, and it's no doubt that some of the most vulnerable people to these privacy breaches are immigrants, especially given Trump's mass deportation agenda. The next lawsuit that I want to discuss addresses the dismantling of multiple agencies within the Department of Homeland Security, tasked with essentially protecting people from any abuses that may occur at the hands of the DHS. So, what does this signal to you that the Trump administration has tried to get rid of this DHS oversight?
So we're very concerned that on March 21st, three different offices that were set up to protect civil rights and civil liberties and the individual rights of immigrants were all essentially dismantled and told to stop performing their work. So there's an office within the Department of Homeland Security called the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and that office has been in place ever since 2002 to safeguard privacy and civil rights and constitutional rights, and make sure that whatever the Department of Homeland Security is doing, whether you're talking about Border Patrol or whether you're talking about ICE detention or TSA screenings at airports, that there's the policies of DHS are adequately taking into account constitutional rights and making sure that those policies are not being discriminatorily applied in a way that's racially profiling or religious profiling or harming people based on any protected traits under the civil rights laws. And so the fact that everyone in that civil rights and civil liberties office was basically given, a notice that we're going to fire you, we're going to sort of close down your office, and all of the 150 people who were working in that office are soon to be out of a job. That's very concerning, because it's one of the few sort of guardrails or protections to make sure that constitutional rights are being respected, and that there's some sort of balance for the great power that the Homeland Security Department has to pull people off the streets, to control, to revoke visas, are not being used in a way that is discriminatory or that runs afoul of the Constitution. And then there's also this Ombudsman's Office, which specifically is tasked with making sure, there's actually two different ones. One is for the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman, which is to help people who are running into problems with their visas and with getting their legal immigration status. And when you see the sorts of problems that students are having with their visas being, revoked, or just not understanding what their status is, having this Ombudsman's Office that they can go to for help was a critical sort of safeguard, and that's also being taken away. And then the third office that's being taken away relates to people who are in immigration detention. So that's people who have been, brought to one of these ICE detention facilities, and there had been an office that was actually created during the first Trump administration called the Detention Ombudsman's Office, and there were people who were actually tasked with being on the ground in these detention facilities to take complaints from people who were being detained and to observe conditions and monitor for human rights abuses. And so the fact that all of those people have been told to stop work and that they're basically being laid off from their jobs, where they're the eyes and ears on the ground to really give sort of the first line of defense, or call out a warning, like a canary in the coal mine, of what are the conditions, are there human rights abuses, and be a place that people can go to report those sorts of things. It's really disturbing and concerning that those protections and safety valves are being taken away. And so we filed a lawsuit a couple of weeks ago on behalf of human rights groups and legal services organizations who represent immigrants and assist people in detention, and who had gone to these offices and brought complaints in the past, but are not able to do so any longer because the offices have been removed. And we filed this lawsuit in district court in DC, arguing that Congress established these offices of civil rights and these ombudsman's offices. The Congress, felt that those checks and balances that they provided were essential, and the executive does not have the right unilaterally to take them away.
And your team has asked for a preliminary injunction regarding this case, which would prohibit the Trump administration from taking any further action to dissolve or cease the functioning of these three DHS oversight bodies in question. Do you have any examples, maybe from the human rights organizations that you're litigating on behalf of kind of concrete harms that have occurred since these offices have dissolved, or concrete worries that will occur in the future?
Absolutely. There are many concrete examples. We pointed to, in our complaint, we pointed to an individual who had filed a complaint with the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office because they were detained. A family with U.S. citizen children and non-U.S. citizen parents was detained in the course of seeking medical treatment for the child's who has brain cancer, and they were all placed in detention. The CRCL office was contacted to intervene or to look into the situation, but then just a few days later was shut down. So that's one example. People who are being denied medical attention for serious medical conditions and who would normally have gone to either the CRCL office or the detention ombudsman to report that lack of medical care now no longer can do so. And in terms of the CIS ombudsman, one of the things that they're able to help with is people who are victims of human trafficking or domestic violence and who are seeking immigration adjustment under the Violence Against Women Act. And they would normally, have gone to the CIS ombudsman for help getting their petitions expedited and now cannot do so. And so people are being, sort of denied protection and often forced to stay in abusive relationships because they can't get the immigration assistance that they need. Well, there's a lot of information that doctors, that researchers, that members of the public have relied on from government websites maintained by the CDC, by Health and Human Services, and in the early days of this Trump administration, many of those websites were taken down because they were under the auspices of responding to the executive orders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or gender, or in the case of environmental data, there were um, documents that were taken down because they referred to climate change or sustainability. And so large swaths of information have been taken down from government websites without any warning or without any sort of advance notice that would give people an opportunity to download or safeguard, information that they relied upon. And we've brought a couple of lawsuits to challenge that wholesale sort of decimation of publicly available information. So there's actually 3 cases I would say that fall in that category. The first one we filed was a Doctors for America case against Health and Human Services and several of its sort of component agencies that took down large amounts of health-related data because they referenced gender or different effects, of sort of health effects on women and men, and that was seen as violating the executive orders on gender and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also brought a case on behalf of the Sierra Club involving removal of information from various websites that EPA was managing or Department of Energy regarding climate change or regarding how pollution and sort of the disparate effects of environmental conditions on different populations, and that was important information that many groups like the Sierra Club, like the Union of Concerned Scientists, who's also a plaintiff in that case, were using for their research and using for their own activities, and all of that was abruptly taken offline. And then the third case that kind of falls in that category of public access to public information was a case that we filed on behalf of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington crew, and that case involved a public database that the Office of Management and Budget was required by statute to operate, to basically show how budget decisions were being made by OMB. So when Congress appropriates funds, they go to the agency, but this Office of Management and Budget kind of plays an intermediary role, and to give more transparency to what that intermediary role is and what budgetary decisions were being made and how federal money is being spent, Congress required this public database to be available and searchable, and so people could understand how their money was, how Congress was basically spending their taxpayer money, and Crew was using that information for various purposes, and that was also shut down in late March, where the OMB just simply said it was not going to operate that website anymore and took the database down. Again, just clear violation of statute and clear violation of what Congress required them to do.
So, Public Citizen has actually been successful in making sure some key health web pages remain available while litigation proceeds. Can you describe how Public Citizen's legal team went about achieving this victory and the path forward to restoring this public information?
So, one of the great things about the court system is that it's possible to go into court and get an action to be taken very quickly if you're able to show that the organization or individual, that is bringing the lawsuit is being immediately harmed by whatever the defendant, in this case the government, is doing. So going into court, um, initially sort of file your lawsuit, explain what the harms are, what the defendant is doing wrong, and you can then very quickly file what's called a motion for a preliminary injunction or a motion for a temporary restraining order, which says this is an emergency situation. I need the court to step in right away to um, sort of undo this harm and prevent any future harm from happening. And with regard to the websites, what happened was we filed the case on behalf of Doctors for America that I mentioned, and then we immediately filed a motion for a temporary restraining order saying that these websites have been taken down. There's information that doctors who are part of the Doctors for America group rely on in advising and treating their patients, and they really need access to this information right now, or else they're not going to be able to give the that will impair their ability to do their job as doctors, that it will they won't be able to sort of make the sort of treatment decisions or recommendations that they would have before, because they would rely on this government information to figure out sort of how to advise particular patients in particular situations. And so that this is an sort of ongoing harm. They're trying to serve their patients every day. We can't just wait, for the court to resolve this issue after figuring out, well, did the government actually violate the law here or not, and give everyone a chance to file their briefs. We need the court to intervene right away to prevent irreparable and ongoing harm to the doctors, and sort of by implication also to their patients. So the court held a hearing on that emergency motion and agreed that we had met our burden of showing, that there was an irreparable ongoing harm occurring from lack of access to this information, and so the information needed to be restored. And it's temporary, because the case is still going on. But while the case is going on, instead of the default while the case is ongoing being that the information is gone, the default while the case is ongoing is that the information had to be put back on the websites. And now we'll continue to litigate the rest of the merits of the case, but at least that information is restored so that people who are relying on it, can go back to using it again.
I now want to move to something that a lot of people have heard about in the news, which is Trump's major funding cuts across the US government, from USAID to research grants to a bunch of other things. Can you describe why these funding cuts to USAID, domestic nonprofits, and other humanitarian organizations was unlawful? Why was it an illegal action and not just Trump exercising his presidential power?
That's a great question, and certainly that's what Trump and the administration have argued, is that this is kind of within their prerogative to decide how to spend, to sort of implement their priorities. The reason why we have argued that it is unlawful for Trump to cut funding, for example, to USAID. We filed a case on behalf of the AIDS Vaccine Access Coalition and two other organizations who have received grants and cooperative agreements to conduct foreign assistance activities. And the funding that all of those organizations received was specifically appropriated by Congress. So again, Congress is the branch of government that does two things. They're the branch that makes the laws, and so when we talked a few minutes ago about how the agencies that are part of DHS were established by Congress, and so they need to continue. The same thing goes for funding. So when Congress funds agencies and funds specific um, grants or specific activities to be conducted by those agencies, once that funding is appropriated, there are only very specific exceptions for when the executive branch can choose not to spend the funds. Um, so there is a statute called the Impoundment Control Act that was passed in the 1970s to basically spell out how the executive branch can basically tell Congress, we don't want to spend this money. Here's what we're going to do instead, and there's a specific process that the executive branch has to go through if they're going to not spend congressionally appropriated funds. But here, with regard to the USAID foreign assistance grants, none of those steps were taken under the Impoundment Control Act. Basically, there was an executive order from the president saying, to freeze all foreign aid funding. And then based on that executive order, Secretary of State Rubio issued a directive basically telling all of the grants that any work on any of the grants should just immediately stop. And that would be sort of a different matter for funding that hadn't been appropriated yet by Congress, but for the funding that was already appropriated by Congress, the argument that we made in our case is that violates the separation of powers under the Constitution that basically says Congress gets to make funding decisions, and once Congress makes those decisions, there's very limited, reasons that the executive can choose not to comply with them or choose not to follow through on them. And it also violates a statute that a lot of these cases talk about, which is called the Administrative Procedure Act. And that basically says that if the government is going to change course on its action, it needs to give reasons for why it's doing that. It can't just arbitrarily stop, on a dime. And the reason, without giving a reasoned explanation for that. And the reason for that is that people rely on, expecting that things are going to proceed the way they've been proceeding. And with regard to the foreign aid grants, we're talking about people who had received these contracts, who were in the middle of performing them. They were multi-year contracts. People who were, employed under these contracts immediately lost their jobs when the funding was frozen. They had to furlough staff. It was extremely destabilizing, for the private contractors who were actually doing this work. But most sort of important in terms of who was relying on these grants are the people who were actually benefiting from the humanitarian aid that they provided. These grants were providing HIV vaccines and treatments, for people throughout sub-Saharan Africa. They were providing, nutrition aid and just food assistance to children who were otherwise, at risk of starving to death. They were providing clean water and sanitation in refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other war-torn regions around the world where people don't have access to safe drinking water. And, so this is really a lifeline that people were relying on, to prevent humanitarian cataclysm. And just stopping that funding abruptly without any warning, without any, this is going to be wound down gradually over time so people can look for alternative sources of funding, or partners on the ground can come up with kind of contingency plans for when the funding dries up. None of that was possible because this was done so abruptly and so cruelly and arbitrarily. So that's why we brought the claim under the Administrative Procedure Act to basically say the government acted unfairly and unreasonably in the way that that funding was cut off.
That was a great summary of the impact of the cutting and immediate freezing of USAID and its impact internationally, as well as on domestic organizations like the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition. But another one of the entities impacted by these cuts is the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, which supports workers' rights programs around the world. Can you just talk a little bit about why this organization is important and why someone like Elon Musk might advise the government to no longer spend money on this organization?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the International Labor Bureau work because this is one of those government agencies that perhaps doesn't get, USAID and the dismantling of that agency got a fair amount of attention in the media, but there are other government agencies that also do important work that sort of tend to go more under the radar screen and don't get as much attention. And the work around international labor protections that you just highlighted is one of those important examples. So Congress has, again, going back to my theme about Congress appropriating funds, has created, this international has appropriated funds for basically making sure that there is a foundation for competition among businesses, that everyone is adhering to a baseline of human and workers' rights around the world. So that means, protection against child labor, protection against other forms of labor exploitation. And the reason that Congress created those grants and created this bureau to oversee the grants is that when, U.S. businesses, which hopefully should be, abiding by labor standards that are required by domestic law, when they have to compete internationally with companies in other countries where those labor protections don't exist, it creates sort of a race to the bottom where people who can exploit child labor or forced labor or just have cheap labor because there are not protections in place for basic human rights and basic workers' rights. They can operate, more cheaply and have a competitive advantage. And so the idea was to create sort of a raise the floor for everyone in terms of labor standards around the world, so that the U.S. companies are competing on a more level playing field where everyone in the supply chain is treated with basic dignity and where sort of labor rights are respected. And so the grants that were cut through DOGE actions over the past few months, guaranteed and provided support for labor organizing, labor education in other parts of the world to create, again, that more fair playing field for international labor efforts and to make sure that there are sort of basic human rights and workers' rights protections. And that organizations that are doing that work in other countries are supported, because that is not, it's not just altruistic, it's also in the interests of U.S. Firms that are sort of competing in the global marketplace. So that was, again, congressional determination. The funding for these grants was reconstituted or reissued as recently as 2024, and in the continuing resolution for the budget in 2025, this funding was again sort of continued on. So Congress recognized the continued importance of it even after the 2024 election. But DOGE, sort of took it upon themselves to say, we're going to cancel all of these contracts because we don't see this as being beneficial. And perhaps, I don't know I don't want to speak to the motivations, but again, the sort of public-private sort of mixture of roles, with Elon Musk playing such a large role in Doge and in the sort of Department of Government Efficiency cutting of contracts. There definitely have been a lot of examples where there's a conflict of interest. Um, that we have pointed to. A Public Citizen has issued a report about all of the many conflicts of interest that Elon Musk has. And so when we're talking about, sort of um, international competition and sort of labor standards nationally and internationally, I would definitely think about what sort of how that benefits the many companies that Mr. Musk owns and is continuing to run. But it certainly the basis of our intervention, representing the Solidarity Center and two other recipients of these international labor grants, is that Congress created the program, Congress appropriated the funds, and so the Department of Labor, whether they're influenced by Doge or otherwise, the Department of Labor was the one who officially cut them off, and they don't have the authority to do that because this is congressionally appropriated funding and needs to be followed through, under the separation of powers in the Constitution. The executive branch doesn't have the right to just unilaterally shut down a program that Congress created and gave money to.
The final lawsuit that I want to talk about is something that should probably matter to every American, and it concerns the dismantling of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This entity was established after the 2008 financial crisis to protect people from things like predatory loans, excessive credit card fees, and the selling of their personal data. Firstly, why is it so important that Public Citizen prevents the dismantling of this agency, the CFPB?
Well, the CFPB has brought billions of dollars back to consumers that were cheated or had money stolen from them through predatory lending or scams or fraud. And in the short amount of time that the CFPB has been in existence, only a little over 10 years now, it has been remarkably effective at helping consumers and sort of leveling the playing field between large companies and the sort of uh, financial system and consumers who need to interact with the financial system but can often be taken advantage of and preyed upon by bad actors. And so the CFPB, for all kind of the reasons I was saying before, was established by Congress. Congress mandated that it needs to exist and that it needs to do these various things. It needs to take complaints. It maintains a public database of information for consumers, so it kind of gets at that informational and sort of providing resources to the public that we talked about earlier with regard to the Doctors for America case and the Sierra Club case. It also, sort of uh, brings lawsuits and puts money directly back in consumers' pockets, which it's no longer able to do those very beneficial things that Congress created it to do if the unilateral actions of the administration to shut it down are allowed to continue. So, in early February, again, looking back to Elon Musk and Doge, there was a lot of activity on X posting about with a tombstone, emoji and RIP CFPB. We're going to shut down the agency, and then acting on those statements. The sort of interim or acting director was issued an order telling all of the staff to stop performing any of their work tasks, basically like put your pencils down, we're going to pause all of our work, and then started working on putting together a massive reduction in force to lay off most of the workers at the agency. And we stepped in on behalf of the National Treasury Employees Union and the National Consumer Law Center, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the several other organizations who rely on CFPB to help to help their consumer members or to help them directly. And so we sought a temporary restraining order, like I mentioned before, to cease any further shutdown of the agency. So basically, don't issue those reduction in force, don't actually lay people off, and reverse the action to put your pencils down and stop working, so that the agency can actually go back to functioning and go back to doing all of the important work that it was doing on behalf of consumers.
We just covered a lot of lawsuit specifics, and I want to now zoom back out and get a broader view of why these cases are so important. Overall, Trump is losing in court, but he's also attacking law firms that dare to come after him. And over the weekend, we saw his administration float the possibility of suspending habeas corpus, so another attack on the power of the legal system to combat their agenda. What do these facts signal to you regarding the importance of litigating against the Trump administration?
So I think the fact that the action to challenge law firms who have taken action against the president, is an indication that litigation is effective. That these lawsuits that not just Public Citizen, but many groups have been bringing to challenge the mass deportations, to challenge the excess of executive authority, to challenge the policies that target people for dissent, or that target unpopular groups like trans groups. There have been a lot of cases around the trans military ban, for example, or the inability of people to have passports that match their gender identity. The fact that all of these lawsuits are being filed, and as you pointed out, many of them have been successful, at least at the early stages. It's important to remind the president that there are checks and balances, and that this is a country of laws and not of just a king who can rule by fiat. But I think it's also important to sort of show the rest of the country, many of whom who don't agree with what the president has been doing, that there are mechanisms and there are ways of stopping, or at least slowing down, some of the abuses of power that have occurred. So in other words, we're not powerless. It's not hopeless, and that, well, because Trump is the president, he can do whatever he wants. We are in a democratic society where there are checks and balances, and the courts provide one of those important checks and balances on when the executive does have a lot of authority, but when they exceed what that authority is and overreach what the sort of boundaries are, the courts have a prerogative to step in and sort of reassert those boundaries and reassert those lines. And I think it's important for people to see that, to know that there are checks and balances, and that our system still, that those that there's a role for us to play, as lawyers, as litigants, as people who want to step forward and be part of these cases. Many of our clients are organizations who are grassroots organizations who care about these issues, like the human rights organizations I mentioned in the DHS case, or the consumer rights organizations in the CFPB case. They're participating in the process by being clients in these cases, and by telling their stories and filing testimony in court explaining how these actions have harmed them. That's also participating in the democratic process. And I think it's important for people to just see that those processes are still functioning, and that the president doesn't have all-consuming power.
Karla Gilbride on Public Citizen's 13 lawsuits against the Trump administration. Thank you for watching. Join us next time for another critical examination of our political world.